Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Mini J School 2021. I am Fred Ehrlich. I'm the politics editor at St. Louis Public Radio. This is our third session in the series, and we're very excited to be discussing political reporting this evening with my A team of political reporters. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis, an institution that transforms lives through education. We want to thank our members for supporting us. Our more than 26,000 donors, many of you are among them, contributed over $6 million last year, which allows us to bring you award-winning local news, podcasts, and events like this. So we'll get started. It could be argued, and I would be one that would argue this, that political reporting is more important than ever. Joining us to share their experiences covering politics at the local, state, and national levels during a pandemic and also unprecedented upheaval tonight in our government are St. Louis Public Radio's own Jason Rosenbaum, Rachel Lippmann, and Jaclyn Driscoll. I'll tell you a little bit about them and then we'll get right down to it. Jaclyn is the Jefferson City State House reporter for St. Louis Public Radio. She joined the politics team in 2019 after spending 2 years at the Springfield, Illinois NPR affiliate. Rachel covers courts, public safety, city politics, a boatload of other things for us. She joined the NPR affiliate in her hometown here in 2008. That was after spending 2 years in Lansing covering the Michigan Capitol for NPR affiliates there. And last but not least, Jason Rosenbaum is the political correspondent for St. Louis Public Radio. He spent more than 4 years in the Missouri Capitol writing for the Columbia Daily Tribune, Missouri Lawyers Media, and the St. Louis Beacon. He's also one of the creators of our deep dive into all things politics, the Politically Speaking podcast, which all three of the reporters here regularly participate in, and we are very proud to bring you that. So those are the introductions. Let's get down to it. You can drop your questions in the Q&A feature in the chat, and we'll get to some of them a little later in the session. So we're going to start off here with I'm gonna have everybody, each one of you guys talk about how you normally approach your beat and how that's changed during the pandemic. Jason, why don't you start?
I mean, how has everything changed during the pandemic? We could talk about that for the next 10 hours. I think the main issue that I've been focusing on since the pandemic started about a year ago has been the changes in Missouri's voting processes, especially when it comes to absentee balloting. That was something that right away, I would say in mid to late March of last year, I knew was going to become a huge issue, just because people were going to become naturally hesitant to go to the polls and congregate when COVID-19 was spreading. So that was probably the number one thing that I focused on in 2020. Number two is probably redistricting, which, as Jaclyn and Rachel can probably attest to, is a somewhat of an obsession of mine that has dated back almost 10 years at this point. I would say that both of those issues have been affected tremendously by the pandemic. In fact, I had an article, I think a couple weeks ago, about how the delays in the census data is going to mean that at best, Missouri's redistricting process will get wrapped up the very end of 2021. And more likely, it's going to stretch into 2022, which would be not necessarily unprecedented, but certainly making a lot of people nervous. The other main thing that's changed is I'm just doing a lot more reporting from home, and we're doing podcasting from home. And the challenge of juggling being a journalist while also raising a family and trying not to catch COVID-19 is probably something I don't want to repeat. And I'm looking forward to this virus becoming something we remember vaguely as we look into the future without it.
All right. Jaclyn, how do you answer that question?
I would echo what Jason said about just being a journalist at home, trying to raise a family. I'm a single mom of twin boys who are 5, and they just started going back to school only for 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday. So I've been full-time mom with them doing pre-K stuff and obviously doing my full-time job as a reporter. So I am very excited for the pandemic to be over and to get my children back to school so I can have some sense of normalcy. Also, it's been really isolating since we don't go to the office. Not that I was in the St. Louis office prior, I was in the State House, but I was surrounded by other reporters at least. So it feels a lot different to be in my house reporting and just kind of calling lawmakers instead of popping into their office to see what's going on. That's a huge change because, it's a lot easier when you're standing face to face with them. Speaker, are you going to call this bill today? Rather than shooting them a text message they don't have to respond to. So there's been some challenges there, but in terms of specific issues, last year felt like a never-ending session. We never really got a break because they never really left. They were in the legislative session and then they went into one special session and then another special session. And then this year's session started. So it's been really exhausting. I'm so ready for May, but it should be a busy year with session. The budget was really important because of all the restrictions and the economic effects of COVID-19. So that was something that I focused on a lot and something that I still think is going to be very important this year. And unfortunately, I believe I'm the only one who contracted COVID-19. I got it pretty quickly after the legislators were sworn in at the Capitol. I don't really know where I got it, but that was not fun. I wouldn't wish it upon anyone. And we've seen a lot of legislators come down with it too. So kind of navigating how we cover session in a safe way, but still able to get work done for the people of Missouri.
All right, Rachel?
So I have been lucky in the sense that the bodies that I cover mostly, St. Louis County Council and the St. Louis Board of Aldermen, switched to remote legislating very quickly after the pandemic started. So I'm still covering a lot of meetings. They're just being done sitting in front of my computer as I am now talking to you, listening to what they have to say in a Zoom screen rather than them being in a chamber talking. So in that sense, how I cover my beat, that side of my beat, the politics side, hasn't changed in the sense that it's still a lot of meetings, and you're still watching and following along with them. But yeah, it's been isolating not to be in the office. It is a lot easier to communicate with the alders and the county councilmen when you're there and you see them. I've been lucky enough to have been covering Board of Aldermen for long enough that people know who I am, and not seeing my face doesn't really matter. They have like a face to the name already, but it's, different when they're not coming up on the floor to talk to you and saying hi and, dropping little tidbits to you as to what is going on. Some of them still do, text me and say, hey, keep an eye on this, but it is a much different experience trying to adapt to virtual meetings for them and for us. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. And yeah, it is just kind of an isolating experience sitting in front of your computer for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day without really other, you don't really feel like you have a break. And I'm lucky enough to be the only reporting member of the politics team that doesn't have young kids, just fiance, dog, and cat, and they're annoying in different ways, but they don't require my attention.
No, the isolation, it is a huge factor. I feel that too. I miss seeing everybody each day, and it makes everything that we do harder. There's no doubt when I just can't turn around at my desk. We've been out of the office since March. I believe it was March 17th, if I'm correct. So we're coming up on a whole year of operating like this. And while we've gotten better at it, there's still a lot of challenges to it every day. And that leads into my next question. The November election, which was obviously a big one, was the only time since we've been, working remotely that we actually did get back in the office to work together on election night. We socially distanced, we masked up, we followed all the precautions, and it was kind of nice to be back. But I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about that November election because it was so big, it was so important. And how was covering that different in both the pre-election coverage, the things that we normally cover, and actually on election night with the pandemic? Jason, why don't you start?
It was a lot different because there were fewer events to go to. And I found that one of the ways that you gather string or you get color in election season is going to rallies or, traveling to different places and talking with, mainly partisan voters, but still voters. There were just fewer opportunities for that. I went to one such event in St. Charles near the very end, but I don't think I really used anything because it was the Saturday or Sunday before the election, and we typically just don't do stories that close to an election. One thing that we did do that I am actually very proud of is we managed to get all the statewide candidates on Politically Speaking, including Governor Mike Parson and State Auditor Nicole Galloway, as well as people that were running in competitive congressional, state legislative, and local elections as well. And in prior election cycles, we often didn't get like one or two or three people. Like in 16, we got Eric Greitens, but we didn't get Chris Koster. We didn't get Jason Kander or Roy Blunt that year. So the fact that we were able to do that, I think is a testament not only to just tenaciously bothering people to come on our show, but because we could do a lot of these shows via Zoom, it allowed us to get these shows done a lot quicker. There were some people, and I'm sure Jaclyn can mention this, that actually preferred to do the shows in person. And in some cases, I know that I drove to like a car dealership in St. Charles to interview Lieutenant Governor Mike Kehoe. I went to a couple of campaign headquarters. I actually interviewed Jay Ashcroft under a gazebo in Chesterfield. So I really did kind of enjoy that part of like traveling to interview people face to face, because even though the Zoom podcast meant that we were able to sustain a consistency, I really think that doing those shows face to face makes for better shows. So I'm glad we got to do that.
Rachel, how about things changing for you for the election?
I agree with Jason. Just the lack of events was weird. The lack of saying like, oh, hey, are we going to worry about them outlining this platform piece here? And also, we knew we likely weren't going to get a ton of surrogates or other kind of presidential related stuff here. Missouri has tipped very heavily red, so we weren't likely to get, big campaign rallies for that. But, election night was weird. It's usually a communal experience in a lot of different ways. You're going with candidates. That's a big communal event, is the watch parties. Most of the Democratic candidates didn't do anything this year, and the Republicans had a very limited event in Springfield. So, just the lack of community, I think in some ways was really the biggest thing, even, from our own coverage, and then even among the candidates as well. The D's and R's will usually do their own big joint parties somewhere, where all of the candidates for that party are together. And that didn't happen this year. But like Jason said, I think the fact that we, were able to and did get all of the, on both sides of the river, Missouri and Illinois, candidates on, was a testament to, we were going to find a way to get the information to listeners and readers, even if it meant driving to a gazebo or, being masked up at a campaign headquarters, or Jason and I did at least one, possibly two, in a candidate's backyard. So, we have figured out how to be adaptable through all of this, but I think I can say that we are all a little bit tired of adapting and just would kind of like to get back to what we know how to do and how we know how to do it.
Jaclyn, how did things change for you in the election coverage?
Well, I think I was, and excuse me if you can hear my dog lapping water in the background. He likes to steal the show. So I actually never went into the station. I was the lone soul who stayed home to cover the election in November. I was home in August because, again, I have kids who needed some type of guardian. So again, it was just a really isolating experience. Elections, love them or hate them, they're kind of like our Super Bowl for political reporters. It's what we work up to. As Jason mentioned, we were doing all these politically speakings, and just felt like we had this culmination leading up to election day, and then I was just kind of by myself when everything was rolling in. So that was a little disappointing, and I can't wait to have an election night where we share pizza and we can like not wear masks and just have a good time all together, because election nights are really a good time, busy for all of us, but also a really good time. You know, we walk out of the station at like 4 a.m., but you feel so accomplished because you're reporting on something that is so important to so many people. So I would say just being isolated, that's what's changed. As we mentioned, no really events to go to. There were some Zoom watch parties, I believe, but it was kind of lackluster. As big as it was on the national scale, the presidential election was so huge. Just felt like what was going on in the state, again, it just didn't match what was going on, what we have seen in previous years. So hoping for an exciting election with my team in person soon.
And pizza, for those of you in the audience who don't know, that's an election night tradition at newspapers, TV, and radio stations. We all have communal pizza. And even though we actually were back in the office for election night here, most of us, except for Jaclyn, we still couldn't have pizza because you couldn't have shared food. So we had to, keep our distance. So it's just it's a fun, nice tradition. And I'm hoping to get back to that next year as well.
We did have leftover Halloween candy, though. There was
Yeah,
a lot of leftover Halloween
That's right,
candy.
we did.
Nobody sent me any of that, so thanks, guys.
It blames Sarah Fensky for that one. She was responsible for the leftovers.
Next year. And Jaclyn, since you're the baker, we expect baked goods too on an election day. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. Those first couple questions were for everyone. I'm going to get into a little bit more specific beats here. So Rachel, I'm going to start off with you. We have a big election coming up. As a matter of fact, it's tomorrow. We're doing back-to-back big things here with the Mini J School tonight, and election night in the primary in St. Louis is tomorrow. We'll have a new mayor and a change board of aldermen, which is also heading for ward reduction. So how do you see these huge changes playing out in 2021?
I think a lot of that is going to depend on who ends up being the mayor in April. The biggest change is that for the first time in a very, very, very long time, the April general election is going to matter. The city of St. Louis has shifted to a method of voting known as approval voting, where you can vote for as many candidates as you support in the March primary, and into the April general election, it is a top two vote getter runoff. So, the intent was to have candidates who could build a broad base of support from across the city, rather than just having to secure enough to get 25, 30, 35% of the vote in the primary. And that, I think, is going to shape redistricting in the sense of, will this mayor want to keep it in the hands of the Board of Aldermen, where you're going to have people scrapping for every little sliver of a ward, or figuring out who they want to run against, or figuring out whether or not it's all worth it to even run again? Or do you put it in the hands of a citizens commission where they are focusing on equity issues and not so much on sort of their own career? And, it would be up to the mayor to sign legislation changing that. It would be up to the mayor to try and sway people to a map that she or he wants by saying, I had one person tell me, hey, I will help you get resources into your ward, get support into your ward through improving the Citizen Service Bureau, which is the agency to which you can send your complaints about your neighbor not picking up trash, et cetera. Kind of make promises to help support them in their, ward service kind of role, and move them more towards a legislative body. So the mayor's race is really, I think, going to shape a lot of things going forward, including potentially that redistricting question. So that's going to be interesting, is to see which of the two candidates advance, or which of the four candidates advance, and then who ends up getting elected. But yeah, that ward reduction is also going to be incredibly interesting, and who gets on board with whom to protect whom, or who gets drawn into wars with each other, and who just decides, this isn't worth going up against colleagues of mine who have been on the board for X number of years.
All right. Jaclyn, what's the biggest adjustment that you've seen coming from covering the Illinois legislature to Missouri?
What isn't different about Illinois and Missouri is a better question.
You can answer that one.
Missouri has a supermajority Republican, in both chambers. Illinois is the exact opposite, supermajority Democrat. They both have the same party governors. So obviously Democrats rule in Illinois and Republicans rule here in Missouri. So that is definitely a big change. Just in terms of the types of legislation that we see moving throughout the state house. There are very different priorities. In terms of just my reporting, I have found in Missouri, and I want to emphasize that I have only reported in the Missouri State House during COVID times, which seems crazy. It feels like I've been here. I feel like last year was about 12 years long. So I do want to emphasize that, but also in Missouri, accessibility I've found is a little bit more of a challenge. In Illinois, when you are a state house reporter, you have access to the floor. The press box is literally on the floor. You are in reaching arm's length from senators. So it's a lot easier to just run down to the chamber, grab a senator off the floor during debate to get a soundbite, something you need. In Missouri, that's much different. You're a floor up in both the House and the Senate, so you don't feel as intertwined with the action. But with that said, I have gotten cell phone numbers a whole lot easier in Missouri because in Illinois, you can just go grab them on the floor. In Missouri, you got to find a way to be able to get a hold of them. And typically lawmakers do like when they can put a quote into a story surrounding an issue that they're passionate about. So that's been helpful. But those are, I would say those are the main differences, just the policies that we see, and then accessibility of lawmakers. I would also say term limits are huge. Obviously, you just saw a giant in Illinois politics. Michael Madigan was defeated by some of his party. He's no longer the House Speaker. He resigned as the Democratic party chair rather. He's the only speaker I ever covered in Illinois. He's the only speaker I ever knew. Here in Missouri, I've already covered 2 House speakers. So term limits are something that's very different. I'm sorry, you can hear my kids. But I also kind of like the switching out and the changing of the faces and trying to get to know more people. So.
And also you have actually talked to Missouri House speakers and gotten quotes from them as opposed to the
I have their cell phone numbers. Michael Madigan didn't even have a cell phone. It's crazy.
All right, Jason, this one's for you. I'd like you to talk a little bit about Politically Speaking. This is Mini J School, so I'd like you to school the audience a little bit about how we choose guests, how you put it together, and anything else that you can kind of tell them about how it works.
Before I answer that question, I do want to just let everyone know that my mother-in-law has spoken with Michael Madigan on several occasions because she used to live in his district, and he helped her with some very important constituent services, more so than many reporters. Now, moving on to the question at hand, I think that really what goes into a Politically Speaking from a week-to-week basis changes depending on a lot of things. Sometimes we want to bring somebody on because they're important and they've been in the news or they're in a high leadership position, and we want to use that podcast format to ask them or her a number of questions. Sometimes we want to highlight people we haven't had on the show before from various areas of the state. For example, Jonathan All and I just interviewed Bill Hardwick, who's a new legislator from the Fort Leonard Wood area. We've never actually had anybody on the podcast from that show, and I'm always trying to bring in people that are, first of all, from areas of the state we haven't talked about a lot, but also just people we haven't had on because there are only a finite amount of legislators from the St. Louis area, and sometimes we've had them on 4, 5, 6, and even 7 times. So anytime you can bring anybody new in, that's another thing. The shows that I particularly like doing often don't involve guests at all, because some of the ones that actually get the most traffic and are the most fun to do are just when we have shows where I bring in other members of the politics team and we talk about an issue or an event. We did that with the state of the state. We've done that with like the year's biggest stories. And Rachel and I are actually going to record a podcast on Wednesday breaking down the results of the mayoral elections. And I actually have found that people really appreciate those types of shows. I want to believe that everybody follows every tweet and every story that we do, but sometimes they're busy and they sometimes need a refresher of the news in podcast format. And from how we actually do it, oftentimes we do it via Zoom. And we sometimes mic ourselves up and sometimes we don't. And sometimes I'm actually in the studio recording from there if my son has childcare or he's in school. I will say that one thing that we've had to sacrifice in the podcast world during the pandemic is sound quality. If we are talking with somebody via Zoom, it's not going to sound the same than if they're in the studio. And as I mentioned earlier, like having to talk with somebody remotely has its own set of challenges, both from a technical standpoint and from a stiltedness standpoint. I found that the podcast we did face to face during the election were a lot more lively because there could be more immediate back and forth. Whereas oftentimes we have to let somebody talk, sometimes for long 5-6 minute stretches, which I'm sure Fred is just thrilled of hearing most of the time. And it's difficult to interject just because it doesn't sound good. So I'm really looking forward to a time when we can start bringing people back in the studio and interviewing them in person. I think that was one of the hallmarks of Politically Speaking pre-COVID-19. I think we're getting closer to that point every day. I don't think we're going to be at that point until vaccines are available to everybody. But I'm hoping that'll be at some point in the middle or latter half of the year.
And Jason, I'm glad you brought up the sound quality because uh, as as I hope most of you or many of you are, regular listeners, I'm sure you've noticed that our sound quality on our newscasts and our features and all our reports is just not quite what it used to be, but we're doing the best we can. And really people are doing a tremendous job, doing newscasts from home. Some people have been recording in their closets because it's a better sound barrier kind of thing. I mean, it's just really amazing what the staff is doing. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I hope people just understand that and bear with us, and hopefully we'll be back in person and sounding better before too long. So we're getting some great questions from the audience. I'm going to turn to a few of those now. Keep them coming, please. I'm going to make sure that I get them correct. So I'm actually going to have them on my phone here. I'm going to read them. This is, a little inside the Zoom call here. This is from Debbie, and this is on a lot of people's minds right now. Assuming you have political biases of your own, how do you keep them out of your reporting, and the converse? How much does your even-handed reporting keep you from having strongly partisan views? That's a great question, and it's just on a lot of people's minds now. Who wants to jump in and answer? Go ahead. Any of you can pick it.
I'll start. I think that it's difficult sometimes to be completely divorced from the things you cover. I don't think you can go through the experience of covering the Ferguson unrest and come out being completely unchanged by that. I'm sure Rachel can attest to that, although I don't think our experiences were exactly the same. We both covered that exact event throughout the same amount of time. And it made me firmly believe that systemic racism is something that needs to be confronted and dismantled in every corner of our country and in our society. And maybe that's an opinion. I'm sure that there are some people who listen to us that think racism is fine and are racist themselves. But I don't think it's going too far off a limb to say that racism is a corrosive and horrible thing in our country that needs to be directly confronted. And that could be an example of an opinion. I think when you're talking about something that is like less obvious than that, I usually make this metaphor that may seem kind of overwrought, but I think makes sense. I compare political journalism to working at a cake factory. When you're done making the cakes every day, you're not going to go home and eat a bunch of cake because you have been around cakes all the time. And I see the same kind of philosophy with covering politics. When you are covering politics, you're really into it. And some of the things you cover are really exciting, are really traumatizing, are make you upset. But after a while, you want to just go home, or in this case, like log off the computer and go do something else with your time that has nothing to do with politics. And it kind of becomes this numbing like feeling where you don't really care what people are saying unless they're saying truly outrageous stuff. If it's just the usual discourse between Republicans and Democrats, it's just sort of like par for the course, and you just have to train your mind not to get super upset with it. And sometimes that's successful and sometimes it's not.
Right.
I have to tell you, it was so much fun during the presidential election and the lead up to it to be covering politics all day, and then to have someone that I do love very, very, very dearly be equally as obsessed with it after hours. It was like, can I please just take a break from this? But I think that the question is to how do you not let your bias get to you in reporting? And Jaclyn, I think, does a really good job of this. Is we know when we have the facts on our side, and as much as people want to say that, there are different facts in a situation, no, there aren't. There are things that are objectively true. There are things that are objectively false. And the best we can do on any side of the equation who we're questioning is to just get up there and say to them, where are your facts? Where are your proof on this? And, it is become a thing now where one party is trafficking more in outright lies and twisting the facts more often. But that's just how I view it as, you come in, you present the facts, you ask them why they are not presenting the facts, or, why this fact is occurring, kind of thing. Like with the vaccines, why is it that rural counties appear to be getting more vaccines than their share of the population? And I used to joke with friends all the time that journalists don't vote not because we can't have opinions, but because we witness how the sausage is getting made and we're just exhausted and we're like, we hate them all. So throw out all of the bums. But I think the best way to kind of counteract biases, which we all have, is to just simply say, here are the facts as we know them, and, base your questions on those facts.
I have a pretty different way of looking at political bias. I think what makes our job unique is we get to talk to both sides of the aisle, and typically on most issues, sometimes there are like facts, black and white, but on most like social issues where you see these more opinions coming forward, getting to talk to people who are passionate from both sides, it makes it a lot easier to not be stuck in your own lane and your own lived experience, because you are getting different perspectives all the time. However, in terms of like personal bias, obviously we all have our own lived experience, we all have our own personal bias, and I try to be as transparent as I possibly can with those. Specifically with my team or my editor, there are certain issues that I just know it's going to be more difficult for me to cover. As a woman, as a domestic assault survivor, as a rape survivor, there are some things that are just very difficult and more challenging for me to cover. Fred is aware of that, and if I need to, Jason, Rachel, they're always available to jump in if something is too heavy or hard for me to cover, which I'm very grateful for. Or if it's something that I have to cover, Fred is aware, and I, make him check my scripts 4 different times. So we're ensuring that like there is nothing slipping through that I may be unconsciously doing because of my lived experience. So I think we all kind of check each other in that regard, which is really helpful. But also, as I mentioned, just kind of getting to talk to everybody. There are so many different perspectives in the State House specifically. There are people from St. Louis, there are people from Versailles, Missouri, that just don't they don't have the same lived experience as one another. So it's nice to be able to go down, sit down in their office and be, why do you think this way? Why is this important to your constituents? And you know, hearing those sides, hearing those stories, because a lot of lawmakers do hear from their own constituents and have personal stories for reasons why they introduce legislation. That makes you a little bit, it makes it feel a little bit more human and less like just a bill that's moving through the state house.
And, you know, that's a big part of my job is being that sort of arbiter of fairness and watching for things. And one of the things I do, we obviously do a lot of election coverage and election advances, talking to candidates. And I literally, if we have a web post, I will literally go through it after I'm done editing, and I do a line count, which means I literally count how many lines of copy in that story each candidate has. It's never going to be exact, but you know, it's close enough. And what we want to come out in the end with is giving everybody a fair shake, a fair amount of time. The same thing obviously applies. We're a radio station. If we have an interview with you know, 4 candidates in the time we have allowed, that probably is going to allow each of them to have 1 sound bite, maybe 2, but whatever. We're not going to give one candidate 3 sound bites and another 1. So, you know, that a lot of that's on me. So this is a little bit of a related question from Kathy. She wants to know how you guys choose the issues that you think are important, and does the news organization in any way choose them, or do you choose them yourselves? That's a question I think on a lot of people's minds these days.
I'll start. I ask people a lot of times, if you follow me on Twitter, I ask a lot, what's going on in the state house that you want to hear more of? Because something that I particularly find that's interesting, you know, Jason is obsessed with redistricting. It's not my cup of tea. So I may think an issue is very interesting, that just isn't to my audience. So I like to ask people why, you know, what they want to hear coming out of the state house, because eventually these policies are going to be the ones that change their lives. I know a lot of people focus on national politics right now, but state politics and local politics is literally what is going to impact your everyday life. So trying to get feedback from our listeners is really important to me. Obviously, there are some stories where my editor or my executive editor may think is very important. I'm new to Missouri, so I'm still learning the lay of the land. I'm still trying to learn what is important to people, what policies we've seen, you know, get brought up year after year after year, Medicaid expansion being one of those that I covered. PDMP, the prescription drug monitoring program, something that, you know, lawmakers have tried and failed for years. So yes, there are some times when my editor says, you know, that's something that's really important. So you need to cover it, and I'll kind of grin and bear it, because sometimes I don't want to all the time, but it works out. But yeah, definitely trying to make sure that also our listeners have some say in the things that I follow as session begins to heat up.
I would say there's sort of 3 ways that I'll approach a story. There are some things that, like Jaclyn said, you know, are going to be a big deal whether or not you find them interesting. The budget, state of the state, issues that keep popping up year after year, Medicaid expansion, that kind of stuff. Then there'll be some things where, you know, our Fred or Shula Newman, our executive editor, say, hey, we need you to, you know, chase this down for whatever reason. And like Jaclyn, you grin and bear it. A little bit, some of it is, you know, people give us tips or say, hey, this is something. And some of it is just stuff that like catches your interest and you have time to go do it. Like one of the stories that I desperately want to turn once I get out of, you know, how many elections in 9 months is the city's parks department uses border collies to chase geese out of the parks. I really, really, really want to just go see a border collie chasing geese. It has absolutely nothing to do with my beat other than maybe it touches on city politics and how the city is spending its money. But come on, you guys, it's a border collie. I want to go see them chase geese. So we have the freedom to, you know, look at things that kind of pique our interest and say, I want to go tell this story. And I got to be the sports reporter in 2019, which was really, really, really cool because I got to go see the Stanley Cup playoffs.
I don't have that much more to add. I would agree that sometimes you got to ask listeners what they want to hear, but also go with your both your instincts and what your editors are telling you you should pay attention to. I think that there are a lot of issues and things that I've covered over the last 15 years that I never thought I would cover. Much like Rachel, I was deputized as St. Louis Public Radio stadium reporter from 2015 to 2017, maybe.
Whenever
Yeah.
the Enterprise Scott Trade Center upgrade was, which was 17, 18, somewhere in that range. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine ending that. But that was actually the only time in my entire journalism career, stretching back to middle school, that I've ever covered anything sports related. So you never know what this job is going to bring on a day-to-day basis.
And I just want to point out that I went to school for sports journalism. That is what my master's degree is in, and I have never covered sports. So maybe someday.
There you go.
Yeah,
That's
but
what
see,
makes
you weren't going to be as excited to cover the Stanley Cup playoffs in 2019, Jaclyn. Come on.
So as you can see, the staff pretty much has wide latitude. I mean, we want to present stories that are relevant, important to our listeners. And that, with the size of our staff, we obviously have to pick and choose. We can't cover it all. We're not the newspaper of record. So it really varies. And, I think we do a pretty good job of keeping our listeners informed about politics and doing other stories like these guys just mentioned. So Justin wants to know, he says, conventional wisdom suggests that politics has become increasingly national. However, the last election and COVID has also shown just how important local politics are. All things being equal, do you think there's more or less focus on state and local politics in the past 5 years?
Oh, less. I mean, just let's take this debate over school reopenings. It's become nationalized, even though Joe Biden has no power whatsoever to close schools. In fact, when Donald Trump was talking about how all schools should be open and using his rhetoric to make that point, my school district decided not to reopen in October and completely ignore him. So, but people think that that's a national decision because it's being talked about in a national context, even though it's either a local or state decision. It's really unfortunate, in my opinion, that national politics, even though it is very important, especially when our country declares war on another country, oftentimes it is not the most important thing in your life, and it's not the closest decision-making entity in your life. It's usually your local or county government, or it's your state government. But both of those things get a lot less of attention because of a lot of reasons. But I think partially it's just the decline of local media over the last 10 or 15 years, and how through consolidation, bad consolidation deals, or just the fact that newspapers are no longer a viable journalistic medium anymore in many smaller towns, those outlets don't exist anymore. And so they're not providing that local news that maybe they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the vacuum is being filled by national cable news or Facebook or whatever. So I think that's been one of the more unfortunate trends I've seen in journalism over the last 15 years. And I don't think that there's really any way to reverse it. I don't think newspapers are coming back. I think you're going to see like a lot of major newspapers shut down in the next 5 or 10 years. That doesn't bring me any joy to say that, but I think that medium is obsolete and is being replaced by, internet-based medium. And with that, you're just going to get a lot less localized news, and it's going to be more nationalized.
I mean, I think that that's true. I think that you are seeing too much focus and, too much of a national lens on covering things. And it does a disservice to people, I think, as well, just in terms of, civic education, civic intelligence, when, they don't know that Joe Biden, Donald Trump, the new Secretary of Education has no say over what their local school district does. And it, unfortunately, I think can lead to results in those elections because people aren't understanding the actual issues at play in their own school race and the power that they have. For example, you know, when we were getting our debate for the mayoral primary together, we got a lot of questions to the mayoral candidates. What are you going to do about the schools? The mayor in St. Louis has no say over the schools. You know, the oversight of the school board of the school district is not under the mayor, but people think that it is, because that's the message that gets conveyed at a national level. So I think I agree with Jason. It is to sort of the detriment that, you know, those issues aren't focused on, talked about, et cetera, and the vacuum gets filled by national outlets.
I won't say too much more because my colleagues here pretty much said it all. Jason, that was horribly depressing. So sad. But I will just maybe to end on a little bit of positive in terms of national, local, state governments. When the coronavirus was at its height, I noticed a lot more people getting involved, watching the daily press conferences that Mike Parson was having, sending us questions about what our governor, what our state lawmakers were doing. So while it was an unfortunate situation, I think that is where people realized, okay, it's not the people in DC that are impacting my daily life. Obviously, there's things like stimulus checks and so forth coming out of DC, but shutdowns, you know, we saw a lot of those in St. Louis County, and people were getting much more involved to vocalize their opinions on the matter. So although county council was covering county council got exhausting with the thousands of comments, it was also a little bit nice to see people getting involved in the whole process of just trying to ensure that their voices were heard, and realizing that it's those local leaders, those state officials that are really going to make the changes for you.
To the extent that some of them lived in this county, which I'm still not sure some of them did, but you know, that's neither here nor there.
I'm glad you actually mentioned the county council, because that leads into my next question. And this, I think, is kind of a fun question in a way, because it fills what we're really trying to do here tonight, which is kind of pull back the curtain and talk to you about how we cover things and give you a little bit of a look in things that you wouldn't see normally. So Mary wants to know, and she directed this to you, Rachel, is the snark and ill will conveyed at St. Louis County Council meetings as genuine as it appears on screen on meeting nights?
I am going to go with actually yes. I think sometimes it is not an act. I think there are sometimes, you know, they can come together on issues. They are not yet, it is creeping towards, they are not letting yet sort of personal animosity get in the way of legislation that they know they need to pass. You know, you're not seeing all of the bills split on a 4-3 line. There are some issues on which, yes, things are splitting on 4-3 lines just because people want to be, okay, I'll go ahead and use the word petty just because people want to be petty. But I think I will go with the answer to that question is in some cases, yes, it is genuine. Jason and Jaclyn have also watched it. They could, you know, weigh in here as well. But my answer to that question is yes, there is some genuine personal animosity on that council.
They're not getting paid enough to be faking it. They get paid $20,000 a year. In fact, I think that's part of the problem. I think that in a county of 1 million people, we should not be paying our county council people like they're part of a volunteer charity board. Like, this is the biggest county. I live in St. Louis County, so I can say this because right here is St. Louis County. It's the largest political jurisdiction in the state. I'm not saying that the 7 people that are there are by any means like unqualified to be there. They're all, I think, dedicated people with strong points of view. But the fact that we continue to treat government like, again, a volunteer charity event and not like a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, to me, I think is part of one of the bigger problems in politics. But it gets into like thorny political questions. Like, if you make a statement like that and say that legislators that are not paid very much deserve to get paid more, are you being selfish? Or are you saying that, you know, politicians deserve to be paid more, but I'm getting paid less? It really hits a lot of emotional notes on both sides. And I mean, I've covered county council on and off for almost 10 years now. There's always splits between the council and the county executive. This is not a new phenomenon. I will say though, this has gotten pretty ugly between the council members, and I don't see it getting any better. But maybe it will. I know that the last question I was very pessimistic, so maybe things will change and they'll all get along, but you know, that's not really how government works. Like there's going to be disagreements. Just this is probably going to get a lot worse, unfortunately.
And Jaclyn, how about your perspective in the legislature?
You know, I think they put on a little bit more of a show than they really are in real life. Talking off record with some lawmakers, some of the most liberal people in the state house say that their biggest ally is one of the most conservative members in the chamber behind closed doors. There are rifts, there are genuine rifts within the state house. There are some people that, you know, will have it out with each other on the House floor, the Senate floor. But for the most part, you know, covering the legislature is kind of boring because a lot of times, you know, we're sitting in committee hearings and these lawmakers are getting along and they're agreeing and they're making, you know, they're making the sausage. They're putting the wording into bills that, you know, makes it a more balanced policy. Obviously, what you see when, you know, when they're arguing on the bigger issues gets magnified because those are, again, the bigger issues. But in the state legislature, I think if you tune in to a House debate on the floor on a very important issue, they don't dislike each other as much as it seems. They usually do get along pretty well.
I got another fun question for everyone here. This is from Tom. He wants to know what each person's favorite movie or TV show based on media or journalism is.
I know. My TV show is Veep. I don't know if anyone has seen it, but people always ask me and they're like, is your job like House of Cards? Which is awkward because like the journalist does some pretty unethical things to get stories. She eventually dies at the end of season 1, spoiler alert. No, it's not at all like House of Cards. It is like Veep. It's just like a constant dumpster fire most of the time. And it's funny. It's a really funny show, and our jobs can be really funny sometimes too.
Bill Winfrey agrees with you, by the way. He just put in the chat, Veep is the best show.
My kind of go-to sort of want to feel good about journalism are two that if they're on, I'll watch, and that's Spotlight and All the President's Men. They're sort of they're very similar in like their vibe is sort of just like, here is how we got this story kind of thing. And it is, you know, it shows you the work that does go into journalism on both a day-to-day and a, you know, bigger, broader investigative level kind of thing. So those are the ones that I'm going to turn to if I want to be like, you know what, journalism can do some good. Although then I realized that Bob Woodward was like 27 when he broke that story and the imposter syndrome starts to kick in. But those are the ones that like, if I want to, you know, feel good about my profession and that people kind of didn't always hate us, although politicians may have always, those are the two I will watch.
I'm going to give two less serious answers. First of all, there's a plot arc in the television show The OC where Kirsten starts a magazine with the another character, Julie Cooper, which I'm actually watching right now. That's one of the best shows of all time, and there is a journalistic link there, so I'm going to say that. And also both Anchorman movies, including Anchorman 2, which is a good movie. Some people have said Anchorman 2 was disappointing. I would argue that it was actually very funny. And that's what I'm going to say to both of them because all the rest have already been said.
All right.
And we do know people like Anchorman. Like he is the character is an exaggeration of people that we all know in the business.
That is true. Okay, well, I'm not going to, well, there's more great questions from the audience. I really appreciate that. I'm going to start wrapping up here because unfortunately, because of a technical issue, we're going to have to end 2 minutes early tonight. But I did want to get in one more question for the group before we do that. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Crystal ball time. What's going to be the biggest political news or issue on your beat for the rest of the year?
I really hope we can manage to go a year without a politician getting indicted.
Nice.
So hopefully not that. I think sort of ongoing COVID recovery is going to be a thing kind of on the economic level. And I think you're going to see continuing ongoing discussion about criminal justice reform are going to be some of the things that I'm going to have to watch.
Particularly in the state house, I'll be fast. The push to expand charter schools and the so-called school choice measures are going to be very important, and I think that they're ones that are very, very important to our audience as well. Also, we saw a bill move through the House that essentially nullifies all federal gun laws. I think that that's going to be very important as it moves through the Senate, and if senators try to change anything, obviously Second Amendment is very important here to Missourians. I think that's going to be another big issue.
All right, Jason.
This will be the year that Missouri expands Medicaid. And even though that issue is not going to be contentious, I think that the execution of that is going to be important for literally thousands of people. Also, I even though redistricting is very opaque and can be kind of confusing, I do think that at the end of this year, that's going to be an issue that's going to affect not only politics, but the way money is distributed and the way political power it happens in Missouri. So I'm going to go with those two issues.
All good. I would, from my perspective, I think that, and this is going to trickle down, or maybe not just trickle down, how things are going to play out in Washington, D.C. with our junior senator, Josh Hawley, who is now on a national stage in a big way. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this mini J school session. Please join us next Monday for investigative reporting with Jeremy Kohler from ProPublica, easy for me to say, Molly Parker from the Southern Illinoisan, and Tom Scheck from APM Reports. That's a really good lineup. I want to thank the audience for all those questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but those are really thoughtful questions and we appreciate it. And I really want to thank my staff, Jaclyn, Rachel, and Jason. I think it came across today. I mean, I am just very fortunate to have them. They make my job as an editor so easy. They really know what they're talking about, and they really present stories to you guys that I think really inform you about politics. So thank you guys. And one last thing, please check out stlpublicradio.org/events for information about other upcoming events at the station. Thank you and good night.